you have your Bibles with you, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 26, continuing our series through the book of Matthew entitled Our King, as we've looked at the life and the ministry of Jesus Christ, our King as revealed in Matthew's gospel here. And we've come to the climax, as it were. The reason that we're here is the way that I've been thinking about it as we've been studying this. This is it. We've come to the time for Jesus to be crucified. He said last week, we saw this, chapter 26, verse 2, he said, "In 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man is to be handed over for crucifixion." So he's established a timetable. He's let us know exactly what's going to happen. And I think last week I might have skipped over that a little quickly. I might have skimmed past that just a little too fast because I want to make sure that we grasp the setting here as we move forward, because we need it to understand what the disciples heard and what we should be hearing in the words that Jesus is saying. So he's said several times at this point that he's going to die, but now he said, verse 2, Passover's coming, and then the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. Now the Passover was the reason that they were in Jerusalem, the reason that so many people were in Jerusalem. Historians say that the population of Jerusalem would have multiplied by 8 during the time of Passover, that it would have been filled up. That would have been like everybody that's in Santa Fe right now coming and spending a week in Espanola here with us. That's what Jerusalem was like. That place was packed. And that was because of Passover. Passover was a time of remembrance, a time of celebration, a time of looking back and remembering the faithfulness of God. Passover was a festival. The word that's used in verse 5 there is a festival of a time where the people would have looked at the Exodus. They would have looked back to their time in Egypt, and they were celebrating the Passover, which was the last curse on Egypt, where if you put the blood of the lamb over your doorpost, you were safe. But if you didn't do that, then the Spirit would come through and it would take the firstborn child. It's a time of seriousness and somberness and of death and rejoicing and freedom and all those things wrapped together as the people of Israel looked back at that time in their history and God's faithfulness during that time. So it's a serious thing that's going on here, and Jesus says Passover is right around the corner, and then after that, the Son of Man is going to be handed over to be crucified. And that's more than just saying the Son of Man is going to die. To be crucified was as much a process of torture and humiliation as it was a form of execution. So Jesus isn't just saying, Passover is going to come and then I'm going to die. He's saying, Passover is going to come and then I will be handed over to excruciating torture, humiliation, and then after that, I will die. So that's the tone that we have here. I wanted to make sure that we circled back to that to make sure that we have those pieces in place, because picking up in verse 17 here this morning, we see that the preparations are being made for the Passover to happen. So if you're a disciple, if you're following the timeline here, every day that draws closer to Passover, and especially the day of Passover, I imagine your stress levels are rising, because Jesus has declared it's going to be Passover, and then I'm going to be handed over for crucifixion. So we disciples were with Jesus, and every minute that brings us closer to Passover, I imagine you're starting to get the pities. You're starting to sweat a little bit, because Jesus just said what's going to happen. So here we are. We pick up in verse 17. It says, "On the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?' He said, 'Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is near. I am to keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' The disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover." So what we're going to see this morning, and we're going to see again, we're kind of setting the stage for the crucifixion. Last week we saw the people, we saw the chief priests, we saw the woman, we saw Judas, we saw these pieces falling into place about how people perceive Jesus, what their valuation of Jesus was. And now we see we're taking the steps forward into the time of Christ's passion, the Passover, the prayer in Gethsemane is coming up. Jesus is going to be standing before Pilate before we know it, and then he's going to be on the cross. The first step of that is the Passover. First movement that we see here this morning is that the last Passover is observed, and we see that Jesus has already made arrangements for where that's going to happen. So they come and ask, like, where are we going to have Passover, which was a very common experience. It was a very common question to ask during this time. Like I said, there were 100,000 more people in the city than are usually there. So it was pretty common practice for people to open up their homes or whatever property they had to make it available for these visitors to be able to celebrate Passover. So the disciples are saying, well, where are we going to do that? And just like when Jesus was riding into Jerusalem, and he said, there's a place that I need you to go. I need you to tell them that the king needs that donkey, and they're going to let you have it, and they're going to bring it here. Very similar to that, Jesus has already made arrangements. He says, I want you to go. You're going to tell somebody that we're having the Passover there, and everything's going to be good. So this was a time of limited space, of limited resources, but the king has he's already made the plans. He knows exactly what's going to happen. This has been all planned out to the detail, even where we're going to be sitting for the last Passover. Jesus has already got it figured out. So that's what we see. The disciples, they do exactly what he tells them to do, and the Passover is prepared. And then picking up in verse 20, it says, now when evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12 disciples. And as they were eating, he said, truly I say to you that one of you will betray me. And being deeply grieved, they each one began to say to him, surely not I, Lord. And he answered, he who dipped his hand with me in the bowl is the one who will betray me. The Son of Man is to go, just as it is written of him. But woe to the man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. And Judas, who was betraying him, said, surely it is not I, Rabbi. And Jesus said to him, you've said it yourself. So here we are, we're at dinner, and I like that. I feel like Matthew, he's so good with the details and just this little piece here. Like, I like that he says that the 12 disciples were there. Not just the disciples, but the 12 disciples were there. All 12 of them, all at the table with Jesus. And they're eating, and then Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me. Again, this is not the cheeriest bit of Matthew's gospel that we've read through, because not only do we have Passover, which is a relatively somber time of reflection, some celebration, but we also have the crucifixion looming, and then, of course, they're at the table, and Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me. And it says the other disciples they're grieved, and they started asking, surely not I, Lord. Your translation, my translation says they began to say, surely not I, but your translation might say that they asked, is it I, Lord? That they're asking the question. And I think this is a tiny nugget, because that's a little odd to me, isn't it? Like, you're asking, like, is it going to be me that betrays you? Like, that's a little odd nugget for it to be in there, but because I think I would probably be more like Peter, who is like, it's not me, like Jesus says, one of y'all is going to betray me, and Peter's looking around the room like, which one of y'all is it? But the disciples are saying, is it me, Lord? And to me, this seems like a humble, faithful response to something that Jesus just said. They trust Jesus enough to believe him when he says things. And so he says, somebody's going to betray me, but they're also humble enough not to presume upon their own confidence and to say, well, it's not me. I mean, most of them were. Peter was a little different. We'll see that here in a minute. But they're all asking, surely not I, Lord. And Jesus lets them know, it's the one who dipped his hand in the bowl. When I went to go dip my morsel, it's the one whose hand was in there with me. And this is something that strikes me as odd. This account is in all 4 of the Gospels, and it always strikes me as odd that the disciples didn't immediately jump on Judas. Like, get up out of their seat and get him. Because Jesus said, it's whoever put their hand in the bowl with me is the one that's going to betray me. And in my mind, I feel like if I'm watching this play out, I would have been like, let's get him, like, get Judas. It was him. But they don't do that. And there's a couple of reasons that I think that's probably the case. It might have been difficult to remember okay, which one of us had our hand in the bowl at the same time Jesus did? Because, you're dipping while you're eating, and it might have been difficult to remember that. We also see in the Gospel of John that this conversation seems to happen as more of an aside. That right here, the details that Matthew gives us, you might think like Jesus has all 12 sitting in front of him, and he's talking to them about the bowl that's in between them. But John, it kind of seems like John himself, leaned over and said, Jesus, who are you talking about? Like, this was more of an aside conversation, so it might not have been something that all of the disciples were privy to at that moment. Either way, what Jesus is showing here is that he's fully aware of the situation that they are in. Matthew said all 12 disciples were sitting at the table. Jesus has them all, and then he does address to the group, one of you is going to betray me. Now, whatever happened with the rest of this conversation, whatever reason we can come up with why they didn't hit Judas on the head with something as soon as Jesus said, whoever dipped their hand, whatever. But Judas knows that Jesus knows, right? Like the jig is up. Judas knows that he's caught, which just makes you want to pop him on the mouth whenever he comes in and says, what does he say? Surely it's not I, Rabbi. He's all close to Jesus. You can almost hear the silver jingling in his pockets as he says it. Surely not me, Rabbi. And Jesus says, surely you have said it yourself. Judas knows that Jesus knows. Judas is aware of this conversation that's going on, which means that Judas heard what Jesus said in verse 24. To me, some of the harshest words that we ever see Jesus say. Jesus usually... He says some hard things to the Pharisees. This is a hard thing for him to say. Verse 24, he says, the Son of Man is to go, just as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. Your translation might say, it would have been better for him to not be born. And so Judas, he hears that, and then he leans over and says, you talking about me, Jesus? Matthew even includes in here Judas, who was betraying him, said, surely not I. And I see this verse 24 specifically, and for me, it kind of opens up a theological can of worms. Maybe y'all didn't think about this. To me, this reveals what I call a profound mystery, a theological burden that we have to deal with. We can't just look over this. And I know if you've been here for the last couple of weeks, you're thinking, again, we're going to keep doing this. I get the impression these last few weeks of Matthew, basically ever since Justin walked us through the joy of the book of Philippians, ever since I got back up here and we got back into Matthew, it's been hit after hit for us, theologically speaking. I remember when I was in college, I was part of the Corps of Cadets, on track to commission into the military. That obviously didn't happen. Here I am right here with you guys. And we had a tradition at the beginning of each semester, we would have a new batch of cadets that would come through, and we would go through a week of intense calibration for those new cadets. And at the end, we would celebrate with a 3-mile run, which involved a run up what we call Crown Mountain. Really, it's just Crown Road is the name of the road, but we would run up it, and it was a winding road that would, every time you go around a curve, it's another incline up to another curve, and then you go around that curve, and guess what? Another incline. And that was the kind of the end of it. We would run a couple of miles around the campus and around the town, and we would always end with the run up Crown Mountain, which was always just a slog. You'd slow way down, and every time you come around a bend, there's more hill for you to get up. And that's how Matthew has felt. I feel like every time we come around a bend here, there's another hill for us to get over. Because we've talked about the fact over the last couple of weeks, if y'all been with us, you remember this. We've talked about the idea that maybe you can lose your salvation. Remember that came up. Jesus said, the one who endures to the end will be saved. Pretty obvious statement there. And we had to deal with the fact, well, what does that mean for once saved, always saved. And I don't think I said this in that message, but I'll say it now, is that I like to say in my mind, instead of saying once saved, always saved, which I believe is correct, if we tweak the semantics just a little bit, I like to say if saved, always saved. The way that we know if you're saved is if you stay saved, if you're always saved. If you endure to the end, you're saved, which is just another way of saying the saved endure to the end. So that's one hill that we had to climb. We also talked about how our works play into our salvation, because almost everything Jesus says has to do with, like, what are our hands doing? What are the actual physical activities of our lives? And he would connect that with our salvation. And so we talked about the fact that we were saved from rebellion and we were saved to obedience. So we used to be active in our rebellion against God, but because of Jesus Christ, he has saved us, given us a new heart, and now we should be active in our obedience and our glorification of God. We talked about that. We touched a little bit on the idea of God's sovereignty and election. We talked about judgment and hell, and we talked about Noah's flood and the end of all things and the billions of deaths that will occur. We talked about those things, and now here we are with another question coming up. Jesus says the Son of Man is to go, just as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. And that raises a question for me, is whose fault is it that Jesus is betrayed? Who's responsible for that? Because Judas, we saw, he went to the chief priests. He said, how much money will you give me to betray him? But Jesus says here that the Son of Man has to go just as it is written, just as it has been established. But woe to the man by whom he's betrayed. My hope whenever I get up and I preach, 3 words that I pray every day, every week for my sermons, is that I would speak with clarity and consistency, not necessarily within myself, but consistency with the word and with conviction. And so I feel like we have to ask these questions of it's determined for the Son of Man to die, but woe to the one who betrays him. What that raises for me is the idea of, like, God ordained this to happen. God established the whole point of the Messiah was to die. God established that all the way back in Isaiah chapter 53. It says that it pleased God to crush him. The Messiah has to die. So then why is Judas in the hot seat? Because of something that God decided. That's a tough question to ask. It's kind of like asking the question. I had a buddy that asked this question one time. We were studying through the book of Genesis, and he asked that age-old question: why would God even put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden? Why even put it there? Make everything, leave out the tree, and everybody's good. Why even do that? And there's questions like that the text for me says it's a profound mystery. There are things that we're not going to be able to wrap our minds around. Romans chapter 11, verse 33 says, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways." So no, I don't get it all. We don't get it all. We can't get it all. And that's okay. Like that should be encouraging to us, I think. I think about the things that I can fully wrap my mind around. Just as a mental exercise this week, I was trying to think about that. I was like, what are the concepts or the ideas or the things that I can fully wrap my mind around? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how few those things are. There are aspects of my life that I understand to a really strong degree, but I don't know if I could confidently say that I've got my mind completely wrapped around these things. So it should not shock us then that we cannot wrap our mind around some of the things that God does. We can't wrap our mind around the idea that God ordained for Jesus to die and that he is going to hold the people who killed him fully accountable for their actions. And that's okay. We should be okay with that. We should be okay with that because we just sang, I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon that cross. We can sing that with confidence, then we should be able to say confidently, yes, I can't wrap my mind around the things of God and the decisions that he makes, but that's okay. That's where faith comes in, and that's where we have to say it's a profound mystery. Do we try? Absolutely. That's why we're here this morning, is because we have to try. But we have to realize that the closer and closer that we tiptoe to that precipice of the abyss of God, the more that we have to acknowledge the fact that whatever goodness we are able to glean, there's infinitely more that we won't be able to reach. And that's okay. One of the things that turns people off to the Bible and turns people off to the idea of God is that he's too complex. That God should be knowable, and when we say knowable, we mean understandable. But to me, the idea that his ways are higher than my ways, as far as heaven is above the earth, that opens the door for me to say, yeah, I don't get it. And I would be shocked if I could. If we could spend 50 years reading the Bible and then close the book and say, I've got it, like that's it. That makes sense to me. Then we're wasting our time here with an itty bitty tiny God, and we should be out doing better things. So that's the question that comes to mind. Was Judas ordained to betray Jesus? Of course, Jesus said, the Son of Man has to go just as it is written. And is Judas guilty for betraying Jesus? Oh, yeah. Yeah. So Judas, he says, surely not I, Lord. And Jesus says to him, you've said it yourself. In John's gospel, Jesus says, go and do what you have to do. And Judas gets up and heads out. But let's not let Judas ruin the evening for us. We're at dinner here, the last Passover. And in verses 26 through 30, we see Jesus institute the Lord's Supper. It says, while they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and after a blessing, he broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. And when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for forgiveness of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. And after singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So, this is the good stuff right here. Like the Lord's Supper instituted, and Jesus stands up and he takes bread, he gives thanks, and he breaks it and he passes it out and he says, this is my body. Same thing with the cup, poured out for the forgiveness of sins. And I wish, personally, I wish that we could really establish the weight of this moment. I've heard better teachers than me talk about this, and I still feel like it's hard to grasp what Jesus is doing right here. Because we don't have the weight of the Passover. It's hard for us to grasp that initially. So to see what Jesus is doing here fully, it's tough for us Gentiles when we come to a text like this. What Jesus is doing with this bread and this cup is putting the pieces of a 1,000-year-old puzzle into place. What he's doing with bread and wine is mending a 1,000-year-old wound of the world with these words, this is my body and this is my blood. He's bringing that to the table. The Passover was all about a spotless lamb being killed for the protection and deliverance of the people who were safe under it. And Jesus is standing at the table and he's saying, it's me. We're not just talking about sheep anymore. We're talking about the Son of God. He's saying, it's me. It's my blood. It's my body. This is for you, for your eternal security and for your eternal satisfaction. Jesus is saying, it's me. All of it. Thousands of years y'all have been celebrating this, and it's me. We've been talking about me. He says this is the new bread and the new drink. The idea of the sustenance, the fact that he's using food to establish this, I think it can be commonplace for us. Obviously, why wouldn't you use food as bread and the juice? But the sustenance that comes along with the bread and what that establishes when Jesus says, "This is my body." In John chapter 6, verse 35, he said, "I am the bread of life, and he who comes to me will not hunger, and he who believes in me will never thirst." And this is one of the reasons, several reasons I think, but this is one of the reasons that I can't quite get behind the idea of transubstantiation. Have y'all ever heard of that? The idea that when you take the elements of the Lord's Supper, that they turn into the actual body and the actual blood. That's what Catholics believe. And I can't get behind that fully, because if Jesus is talking literally here, this is my body, I'm the bread, whoever comes to me will never hunger. If he's talking literally here, then why are Catholics out at La Cocina with the rest of us? Why are they hungry? If we're talking literally here, if we're really talking about God, Christ's body and Christ's blood represented by this bread and this wine, if we're talking literally, then why are they hungry? If they literally have Christ's blood and his body in them, why are they hungry? If we take a step back from that and we think about the symbolism of what Jesus is talking about, if we take our minds off of our bellies and off of our mouths and off of the bread for a minute, we realize that what Jesus is saying here is that I am the bread, this is the bread. I'm the fountain, and here's the drink. And anybody who comes to me, you're not going to be hungry, you're never going to thirst. But he's not talking about your stomach here, he's talking about your soul. That's why millions of Christians across the planet have empty bellies and are still satisfied. Because Jesus is talking about our souls here. So I like that he uses the bread, and I like that he uses the juice, because it reminds us that just like our physical bodies need these things to sustain us and for us to survive, our spiritual bodies, our souls need Christ for us to survive. As Jesus says, here it is broken for you, and here it is poured out. So that's the horizontal care that Jesus is establishing here. But then he brings this word covenant into the mix. What was that? Verse 28. For this is my blood of the covenant. And what covenant perks my ears up to is that Jesus is not just talking about horizontal satisfaction. He's not just talking about horizontal sustenance and provision. That his mind is also on vertical satisfaction, vertical provision. That's what the word covenant brings up. Because the old covenant, you look back at the Old Testament, the old covenant had so many pieces to it, but it comes down to the fact that God promised Israel, I will be your God and you will be my people. That was the old covenant. And I like the way that Tim Keller phrases this. We talk about the word covenant. He says a covenant is more legally binding than a mere promise, but much more emotionally invested than a mere contract. That's what a covenant is. So God promised in binding terms, I will be your God and you will be my people. And then the issue with that covenant arose in the fact that these people that God established were a bunch of sinners. So now the holy, righteous God, who can't look on sin, who hates sin and wants to destroy sin, has to destroy sin. His holiness and his justice require it. Suddenly he finds himself in a covenant relationship with a bunch of sinful people. So what's the answer to that problem? Does God break his covenant? Does he go back on his word? Is that what God does? No, he can't do that. No, instead he ratifies that covenant with the new covenant in the blood of his son. When we look at Jesus and he says, this is my blood poured out for you, what we should hear is God saying, I would rather die than break my promise to my people. Y'all are sinners. And he fixes that. He says, this is the blood of my son poured out for sin. A new covenant in the blood of Jesus. And this covenant brings for us a hope and a future where before there was just wrath. John chapter 3, verse 36, it says, he who believes in the Son has eternal life, but he who does not obey the Son will not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him. But in the blood of the covenant, in this new covenant in Jesus, we have a hope and a future. Before it was all wrath, and now Jesus is talking about the drinking together anew in the kingdom of the Father. He says, I will not drink of the fruit of this vine from now on until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. So before it was wrath, and now there is the promise of a future. Jesus says we're going to be together in the kingdom. And then verse 30 says, after singing a hymn together, they went out to the Mount of Olives. The last movement that we're going to look at this morning, verses 31 through 35, is a good reminder for each of us, it should be, that Jesus does all of this. He does all of this fully understanding, fully aware, fully knowing that his sheep are going to be scattered. So this isn't, I like what Stan brought up. He said, how'd you say it, Stan? That Jesus, he looked through time and that his death was for us as well. That wasn't because Jesus had established a time frame for his death on the cross, and then when you and I came along and we started sinning, Jesus had to extend that time frame to involve us as well. You know, like he was fully aware before you were even born, before your grandparents were born. Jesus was fully aware of your sin when he went to the cross, and I see that pictured beautifully here as he foretells the scattering of his sheep in verses 31 through 35. What I see going on here is Jesus letting his disciples know, I know that you're going to be scattered, but that is not going to deter me from my body being broken and my blood being spilled for you. So let's look at it. It says, Jesus said to them, you will fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go ahead of you to Galilee. But Peter said to him, even though all may fall away because of you, I will never fall away. And Jesus said to him, truly I say to you that this very night, before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And all the disciples said the same thing too. So just like we talked about how it was written for the Son of Man to die the way that he dies, it's also written that once the shepherd is struck down, the sheep scatter. Even, it seems, against Peter's will, he comes up and he says, even though everybody falls away because of you, not me. Which, you know, we all appreciate Peter. He always rushes headfirst into the wrong answer most of the time, but you got to admire his zeal, you know, like, I don't care what happens to everybody else. I'm not going to deny you. But if we, zoom out just a little bit, even though he's zealous and even though it's admirable, the stance that he's taking, he is essentially saying, Jesus, you just said everybody is going to betray you, but not me. You're wrong. Even though Peter is kind of admirable in this moment, he is refuting what Jesus just said. He's saying no to what Jesus just said. Not the first time that he's done this. And because of that, he gets a little bit of special treatment right here, doesn't he? Because he gets, as far as we can tell from the Gospels, he gets the special treatment of a detailed picture of his denial. So he says, I'm not going to do it. Let everybody else fall away, not me. And Jesus says, okay, not only will you deny me, you're going to do it 3 times before the rooster crows. Like, this is not something that's going to happen in a decade or so. It's going to happen before the sun rises today. Peter doesn't back off. admirable Peter. I think that's what Jesus was looking at when he said that you're the rock that the church is going to be built on. I think he admires that about Peter, but he doesn't back off. And this point has been made by several people. You all have probably heard this. Like, people like to get the warm and fuzzies when they say stuff like, Jesus knew that Judas was going to betray him, and yet Judas ate too. Like he was still at the table. Have y'all heard that? I feel like I've heard that. It's sweet. It's a sweet thought, and it's true. But the reality is that Jesus knew every single one of them was going to betray him. He was sitting at the table with his 12 disciples, his 12 guys that he had been rolling with for 3 years, his closest consort, and he's looking around the table, and he knew that when the time came at his darkest moment, that the sheep were going to be scattered, that he'd be there alone. And it's points like this that I think shed some light on the things that Paul says, like in Philippians chapter 2, verse 12, where he says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Or 1 Corinthians 10:12, where he says, the one who stands should take heed lest he falls. Because the reality is that our confidence in the faith, and it's good to be confident in your faith, but our confidence in the faith can sometimes trick us into loosening our grip on Christ. And then suddenly our feet are slipping out from under us. And I see that's what's happening here with Peter. He's so confident. And I don't think there's any deceit in him. I don't think he's trying to trick Jesus like Judas was doing. I think Peter is fully convinced that there's not a thing that could change his mind about Christ. Peter was the first one that we see recorded in the book of Matthew that declared, you are the Messiah. Peter was there. He was on board. He knew exactly who Jesus was. And that's why he can so confidently say, let everybody else fall away. I'm sticking with you. But we have to be careful in our confidence that it doesn't become a stumbling block for us. I know that sounds like double talk, like we should be confident in our faith, but don't be too confident. Like I'm not trying to cause any issues for you guys. Be confident in Jesus. When we start looking at ourselves and saying, oh no, doesn't matter what happens, I won't be shaken, then we're setting ourselves up to fail. Be confident in Jesus. So Jesus, he knew they were going to flake. He understood that. But he went to the cross anyway. And I'll close with this picture of Jesus. Not yet. We still have the Garden of Gethsemane and we see Jesus betrayed. But this picture of Jesus alone going to the cross, it reminds us that he's not like the other rabbis. An influencer who doesn't have a crowd with him, an influencer who is alone, is not an influencer. But Jesus, a rabbi, without his disciples, that doesn't take anything away from what he's doing here. His focus was not primarily on the people that he had around him. His focus was on the Father. So he said, whether I'm alone or whether I got my boys with me, it doesn't matter. I'm here to serve the Father. In a way, I see this as Jesus putting his money where his mouth is, because back in chapter 24, he said, tribulation is going to increase and many will fall away, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And what we see Jesus doing here is becoming, like he always is, our shining example of how that looks. Because tribulation is going to increase and everyone is going to fall away. But Christ, the one who endures, he will be saved. And in that saving, he opens the door for our salvation. The sheep are scattered. The shepherd goes down, and in his glorification after that, he goes back for his sheep. They're still on the run. They're still scared. But because he stays the course, he opens the door for us as well. So that's why I say that we keep our faith in Jesus. And I'm probably going to say something to that effect every sermon for the rest of the book of Matthew, because that's what it's all about. The reason we have the details in here about how Jesus goes down is so that we can see the way that he endures and we can use him as our example to help us endure.